We are now in aspect 5 of Desjardins International Business and Globalization Ethics. He discusses in chapter 12. Here we will discuss the cons of globalization and international business at that scale, as well as what we mean by the notion of the just wage abroad. We have discussed the pros in aspect 4. Here we will discuss the cons, and they are loss of work at home, rising demand, sorry, loss of work at home, lowering of environmental standards and wages, lack of democratic governance, and cultural homogeny. International trade and globalization have less clearly beneficial and controversial effects in addition to the clearly beneficial effects we discussed in the previous aspect. The more developed countries will outsource labor to less developed countries, and that will tend to affect lower paid, less specialized positions. Such less specialized positions are likely in manufacture, and there production is more easy to find than the more specialized labor in the less developed countries abroad. That is likely to mean unemployment at home in those professions. In other words, outsourcing will most readily at first and most directly affect the lower paid positions because lower paid type of labor would be easier to find abroad than the more specialized, higher paid type of labor. But that may mean, this outsourcing, that the newly unemployed will retrain for more specialized professions. And so it would seem that nothing is lost, provided, of course, there is a sufficient number of openings in such professions at home. One theory is that two things will happen. One, the less expensive and easier to afford goods will now be available at home due to imported outsourced products, so that presumably those who are losing work can afford more goods now because the goods are less expensive due to production abroad. Although it's not very easy to see how those who lose work will be able to afford the now less expensive goods. But two, the countries into which labor has been outsourced will rise in wealth, and as a consequence, will demand more of the kinds of products produced in the more developed and more industrialized countries. The latter would seem to guarantee that there will be openings in the more specialized production at home for those who have retrained after they lost their jobs due to outsourcing. But the latter development of demands of product from the first world by the third world countries will depend on the following conditions: that the wages for outsourced labor are high enough, and that the corrupt governments, warlords, etc., abroad are not the main beneficiaries of production in their countries. Such corrupt officials and warlords force the local population to work for low wages and prevent unionization or other kinds of activism and politics that result in higher wages for laborers and have resulted in higher wages and better living conditions in the more developed and democratic countries in the first world. In other words, the theory that as the third world countries into which labor has been outsourced become richer, they will demand more of the first world, more specialized goods. And so whatever is lost in the less specialized employment here at home will be gained by jobs in the more specialized employment. But that would only work if the countries abroad in which business is done actually spread those benefits to the laborers and are not just pocketed by corrupt government officials or corrupt warlords who may force these laborers to work for low wages and will also prevent unionization that would lead for higher wages among these workers abroad. The latter point brings us to an important issue and an argument from Desjardins. How much should firms in the developed countries pay to their employees abroad? On the one hand, the whole reason for doing business abroad is that labor is less expensive there. So, paying laborers there as much as one does at home would defeat the reason for doing business abroad in the first place. On the other hand, paying the lowest possible wage abroad is frequently inhumane. These are the cases of where we hear of workers working for $1 a day or something like that. Desjardins argues that a company should pay somewhere in the middle between the two extremes. In other words, abroad we should pay not quite as high of a wage as we do here at home, but also not quite as low as the lowest wage we can get away with. That would be a win-win situation. Due to lower living costs abroad, a company at home would win from paying less than it would pay to its laborers at home. And due to higher than minimum possible wage that would be paid to the employees abroad, they would also win. Of course, the danger then may be that a company that pays this medium wage abroad would be less competitive in terms of returns to its shareholders than would be a company that would pay the lowest cutthroat wages abroad. Desjardins' response is that what would then be needed in order to make sure that the companies that pay good wages abroad do not become less competitive is international law or voluntary professional guild agreements. The laws or these voluntary agreements would guarantee that all firms operate according to the same standards. In other words, what's needed is laws that mandate that we pay abroad the wages that are not as low as we can possibly get away with. Or they could be voluntary agreements among all of the professionals and businesses in that field. So if there are such agreements, then everyone would be paying the same kind of a wage, and those companies that would pay higher wages would not be less competitive. Let us address the remaining several cons of globalization. One, it may lead to exporting and sharing of the same culture to all places in the world, a homogenization. The paradigmatic here is the McDonald's. It's in all parts of the world, and it is the same everywhere. Do we really want that kind of loss of cultural diversity as a result of international business and international trade? Two, in competition for business, countries may lower their wage and environmental standards, both abroad as well as at home. As countries abroad compete to attract businesses from the more developed first world, they may offer wages that are lower and lower and environmental regulations that are less and less, leading to more and more pollution. In turn, the countries here at home may also order lower wages and lobby for lower environmental regulation in order to compete with these lower paid and less regulated labor abroad. The problem number three is that large international corporations can engage in helping smaller countries by providing work with good working conditions. But they can also do the very opposite. The people of those countries then object that the fate of their countries is determined not by democratically elected leaders that they elect, but by international corporations that may be motivated by nothing other than maximizing profits.